Was there slavery in ancient Egypt? Let's find out. Here, what's going on, party people? The place to be. I go by the name of the BK Apologist, transmitting all the way live. New York is the city. Brooklyn is the borough. What's good? What's popping? It is Monday, another work week, and we are here in the building. So, as always, please like, share, and subscribe, and share this link. Tell a friend to tell a friend that's him again. And we are here. So we have a friend to the show returning. It's been a while since we've chatted, so this is good. Of course, I'm talking about Dr. David A. Falk. What's going on, sir?
It's going on. Yourself?
It's been a rough year.
Hasn't it?
Yeah. So it's. But you know, I'm here. God's been gracious, and we're gonna keep
God's
pushing.
Been very good
all the time, and we're just gonna keep pushing, and hopefully some good stuff will start showing up. You know, well, I can't say that. Good stuff always shows up. You know, I guess I want to see the good that I can physically see. Unfortunately, there's a lot of good that happens around you that you don't see because God is doing stuff. But I would like to see more good stuff in my face. I want good stuff thrown in my face.
We would always love to see the fruits of our labors.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it's sort of a positive feedback. It tells you you're making a difference.
Yeah,
we all want to make a difference.
Absolutely,
I want to make a difference.
And you have so much so you've been kind of making the rounds on these YouTube streets, sir. I've been watching.
Yes, I've been a little busy. I never expected it, to be honest.
Well, I mean,
when I did that review video, that reaction video, I really expected to lose half my subscriber base.
Oh man,
and drift into obscurity.
Quite the opposite has occurred. But I mean, the Bible says, if you see a man skilled, he will serve before kings. And you have this gift and this talent, and you've worked hard at honing this gift of yours, and people are recognizing it, and it was only a matter of time. So I'm just glad that I could play a small part in people.
Small part. You discovered me. Get real. Small part.
So I appreciate that. And and I love the fact that you and IP.
You were a forward thinker.
Hey, I took a shot, and God, this is one of the good things that got thrown in my face. You know what I mean? So,
I'm a good thing.
so far.
I know many people who would disagree with that assessment.
hey, you can't, we're a villain in somebody's story, right? So, I mean,
I think in a lot of stories, I'm the villain.
But but I think
patterns of evidence guys are out to get me. The associates for biblical research are out to get me, and now the atheists are out to get me.
Oh, of course, and because you're associated with me, all sorts of interesting people will be coming at you now. So, unfortunately, it is what it is. So, but yeah, I mean, I know you and IP have been cool and been talking and stuff. So I think
we've been very cool. Yeah.
Shout out to IP. I really love his work and see if I could finagle both of you. I want to get both of you guys together in my chat. Know if I could finagle that. Let's see. Putting it out there, IP. All right. So, but today we'll be discussing something that's been quite the conversational piece in the conscious community, and that is slavery in ancient Egypt. Did they even have such a thing? If so, how did it look like? You know what I mean? So, oh, look, Nate 2D2, Dr. Falk is a delight.
A delight.
How's that for adjective, huh? You are delightful.
Not one I often get.
But a lot of people have really appreciated the work you've been doing on YouTube, and we've all learned so much from you. We really have. So thank you for doing what you're doing.
It sort of shocked me today when I realized that my channel is almost a year old now. It's like, okay, I kind of thought that we had just sort of started here, and it's like a year's passed. Ooh.
Yeah, I mean, it's you just gotta be consistent with with your content, and slowly but surely, people will start recognizing if you're providing good content. You know what I mean? Yeah. So and you are. So this is why you're in the mess that you're in. So oh man. But anyway, so back to the subject. So there have been some talks about slavery in ancient Egypt. One of the things that have been debated is whether or not the ancient Kemetic people even had a definitive term for slavery. I've heard that there are multiple words to define slavery. Now, is there a definitive word in ancient Kemetic culture that describes slavery?
Okay, in Kemetic culture, you have essentially two terms that describe slavery. Okay. The most common term is called ahem, and it means a servant or a slave. And the two terms are in the ancient Near East are sort of interchangeable. To be a slave is to be a servant, and vice versa. You also have what's called the tep-onk, which is the head of life. These were prisoners of war that were enslaved.
Okay.
Both terms refer to kinds of slavery.
Cool.
And they can be interchangeable. A tep-onk can become a hem.
Now, when it comes to prisoners of war, it's also have been said that even if you're a prisoner of war, you can leave your servanthood and actually just become a actual citizen of Kemet. Now, is that possible?
It's possible, but it was very rare. Okay. Very rare. Egypt was a class-based society. It was a stratified culture. And moving between the various strata of Egyptian society was very difficult. It did happen. There were people who did jump all the strata, or not all the strata, but most of them. Like the Chancellor Bey went from being a slave all the way up to Vizier of Egypt. Okay? So it was possible to move between social classes. It was just very uncommon. And it could happen in ways you don't quite expect it to happen. But it was very uncommon. It was very uncommon for a slave to be freed. You couldn't buy your way out of slavery.
You couldn't?
Couldn't. It was not possible to buy your way out. How you became released from the bond of slavery was you would have to be adopted by a free person, and then that free person would have to give you a writ of freedom.
So there was definite paperwork involved in order for you to gain freedom.
There was definite paperwork involved, and there was a definite process. You couldn't just get the writ of freedom. You actually had to be adopted as a child or as a heir of a free person, and then given the writ.
So if you was enslaved in Egypt, you couldn't redeem yourself.
No, you couldn't redeem yourself. That wasn't a possibility.
Interesting.
Now, you could lose your status as a slave by becoming a criminal. But that had its own problems.
Right.
That's what happens to Joseph. Is he starts off as a slave, becomes a criminal, and loses that status of slavery when he goes to prison. At that point, once he's in prison and under the jurisdiction of Pharaoh, he's no longer a slave. He's a criminal.
And from the social strata, that's definitely below criminals, below slave.
Well, you have the social strata, and then you have the outsiders to the social strata.
Okay.
People who don't have any place in society. Criminals are outside the social strata. Magi are outside of the social strata because they acted as community leaders, police, but they didn't fit into a particular tier of society. So you have these people who are outside of the social strata. Beggars are outside the social strata. Prostitutes are outside the social strata. So you do get these people who are outside the social strata.
Wow. We were talking earlier, and you said something to me that I found very interesting. That, of course, when we think in our Western mindset, when we think slave, we think that's just the bottom of the barrel. But in Egypt, that wasn't the case.
No. The slave class was second from the bottom. The bottom class was actually the farming class, the farmers, your herders, your people who tended the fields. And the reason why was because farmers were exceptionally plentiful in Egypt. You would never take a slave and put him to work in a field.
Wow.
The reason why was because slaves were expensive. Slaves had special skills that were very, very valuable in Egypt. So they did work like making wine, knocking figs, metalwork, brick making. These were specialized skills. Think of them kind of like IT workers. Guys with very, very specialized, important skills, but have no respect.
Wow.
I say that as a former IT worker.
Maybe from experience, right?
From experience, yes.
So, shepherds would fall under the same category as the farming people.
Well, they're Semites. Shepherds are Semites.
Right.
They're outside of the social strata.
So they don't even make it to the ladder.
They don't even make it to the ladder.
Wow.
You see, to be in the social strata, you have to be considered what the Egyptians called the remech, or the people. Egyptians had various classifications for its people. You had the remech, and that included everyone who was in the social strata. And then you had what's called the pot people, and those were your upper class. Those were the important, nice, clean, good-smelling people.
Okay.
And generally, the remech begins at your craftsman classes and includes the military, the priesthood, and the scribes.
Right.
That's your upper class. Your bottom, the bottom class, which is included in the remech, that's your farmers and slaves.
Wow. So actually, let me do a quick question here about Ivan. He says, so for Pharaoh to elevate Joseph as governor over the whole of Egypt is a seminal moment in the Bible as it pertains to Egypt?
Yeah. I'd say it's a seminal moment, at least as far as the Bible is concerned. Yes, absolutely.
Because he jumped several strata.
He goes to the top. He goes right to vizier.
Right.
And at the time when Joseph was made vizier, there was only one vizier in Egypt, because that happens during the second intermediate period. During the New Kingdom, the position of vizier sort of divides into two positions, one for Upper and one for Lower Egypt. But during the time of Joseph, there was only one vizier.
Wow. Okay. So another question that's been tossed around is there any relation, depending on whatever kingdom, we're talking pre-dynastic, old, middle, new, is there anything that we find in ancient Kemet that's similar to the chattel slavery that America experienced via the transatlantic slave trade?
The only thing close to, say, chattel slavery was, say, basically traders that would come occasionally into Egypt and sell some slaves. There was a a small trade of slavery that happened across the ancient Near East, across the Fertile Crescent. Okay.
Okay.
So a slave could be sold to a trader who would then take that slave to Egypt and resell them there.
Wow.
So there was a small amount of that, but it wasn't as big as, say, the chattel slavery that happened between Africa and the Americas. It's not quite like that.
Okay. But it's safe to say that it wasn't fun to be a prisoner of war in ancient Egypt. It's pretty safe to say.
No. And the prisoner of war situation was very uncertain anyway. So if you were taken as a prisoner of war and brought back to Egypt, you could have one of several fates just befall you. You could end up being sacrificed in a temple. The Egyptians did practice human sacrifice with some of its war booty. So there was a possibility that you could have been led inside a temple and had your throat cut as a sacrifice to the god. And then your body would be buried underneath the temple. We find an example of one of these bodies under the temple of Mut at Karnak.
So they would kill their prisoners and bury them
inside the temple.
Inside the temple, and then bury them underneath the pyramid.
And bury them underneath.
Wow. Yeah. Now, of course, they speak a lot. Now, this could be propaganda, but you would know better than I would about wretched Cush. Did they do a lot of that to the Cushites? Was there a lot of capturing and sacrificing to them, to their gods?
It did happen to Cushites. It happened to Nubians. It happened to other prisoners of war that they got. Now, on the other hand, too, the other alternative was they could be merged into the Egyptian army as mercenary soldiers. So they're still slaves, but they're now fighting on behalf of the Egyptians.
Right, but they have no rights. They
have no rights. No.
Okay.
No, they have no rights. They are basically soldiers until they're not of any use, and then they are scrubbing floors in fortresses.
Wow. You said something really interesting about how if you are enslaved in Egypt, that you cannot be redeemed. It kind of reminds me of one of the curses in Deuteronomy. That you'll be taken back to Egypt in ships, and no man will redeem you. Well, that makes sense if that was. Because that's the case in Egypt.
That's the case in Egypt. You can't be redeemed.
Right. So
you can only be adopted.
Right. But only somebody who knew ancient Kemetic, well, for us it's ancient, but for them, the culture, only somebody who knew the culture would know that.
Yes.
Right. So once again, the Bible is telling it like it is. So because that's really has a lot of apologetic weight for us, because there are many who subscribe to the fact that they are Hebrews and they identified themselves as Hebrew based on that particular curse. Yeah. That you'll be taken back on ships to Egypt. Now, of course, when they say Egypt, it's metaphorical Egypt, right?
Of course.
but the last part, it says, but no man will redeem you. Well, that makes sense in actual Egypt, because that was the culture.
That was the culture, yes.
Yeah, so yeah, a lot of people are going to be angry with that one right there.
Are you making more friends for me?
Basically, yes. You're going to share my suffering, sir, like the good brother that you are. All right, so you couldn't be redeemed if you're a slave.
Yeah.
But only if the slave owner would adopt you.
Only, and there were some peculiar circumstances too where adoptions took place. Okay, so it wasn't just to adopt you, and basically, most of the slaves that were freed were adults. These were adults adoptions. These weren't children.
Right.
Okay. There's a couple of instances where a widow will adopt a slave, give a writ of freedom, and marry the slave. So you get this sort
ulterior motives.
You get this sort of interesting position where she's adopting a slave as a son, giving them the writ of freedom, and then marrying the slave.
So it's legally the slave is both son and spouse.
And both son and husband.
Yeah, that's awkward. It's a little awkward. Earlier, you talked to me about the concubine's gambit.
Yes.
Please unpack that for the people.
Okay. One of the ways you could become a slave is to sell yourself into slavery, if you can find a buyer. Okay, you have to be able to find a buyer. But let's say you were of the farming class, the lowest of the classes. Okay? And you, as a farmer, you don't own the land. The land is allotted to you, and you work it, and you pay for that allotment through taxes. But what happens if you are, say, a single woman and you lose your parents or your husband, and there's nobody else to help you work the land? You're practically destitute. As a woman in that position, in that culture, you had one of two choices. One, you could become an outsider to the social strata by becoming a prostitute. That was one alternative. But that was not the most desirable alternative. The more desirable alternative was to sell yourself into slavery and become someone's concubine. And this is what forms the concubine's gambit. And how this works is a husband would buy a concubine if his wife was not producing children. And then it becomes this sort of race between the concubine and the wife to produce an heir. Now, if the wife produces a child and then the concubine produces the child next, that concubine can't be thrown out. She's got a position in that home for life. If the concubine produces the heir first, the wife is divorced, and the concubine becomes the new wife, and is now, at that point, entitled a third of all the goods of the household. Okay? And this is why it's called the concubine's gambit. She takes the risk, selling herself into slavery for not just freedom, but for a large payoff.
Now, what happens if the concubine cannot produce an heir?
If a concubine cannot produce an heir, she can be resold.
Wow. So
now here's the thing about being a concubine. One has to be a very good-looking woman to make it as a concubine, because that's what she is selling. She's selling her looks, her virility to engage in that gambit.
So it's like playing dice with ovaries, basically.
Yes.
Wow.
Well, people do it today too, in the form of, say, IVF and egg donations. You know, we still play that game. You know, for a young woman in her 20s who's athletic, has an IQ over 140, has a master's degree, her eggs are worth what? I think it was something like 70 grand.
Wow.
Okay, so yes, people still play that today.
Wow, that's crazy.
It is crazy, but here's the thing. You know, this is what happened, and I mean, we see this gambit play out in the Bible with Hagar. Hagar was an Egyptian. She wasn't a slave as a result of a foreign conquest. She was a woman who sold herself into slavery for the concubine's gambit.
And she won.
She, according to the rules of Egyptian society, she won, but she lost.
Right.
Because Abraham and Sarah don't play by those rules. They, on the surface, they play by Mesopotamian laws, but in reality, they play by their own laws.
Right.
They couch what they do in Mesopotamian law, but they also use the letter of the law to defeat the spirit of the law.
And what is the promise that Yahweh gives to Abraham? How does that affect that gambit?
Well, it's very interesting, because one of the things we see with, say, Hagar is she's, for all her actions, she's never condemned in Scripture. Not once.
Right.
In fact, she's one of 2 women in the Bible to receive a double theophany.
Mm.
I mean,
Can you explain that for the
a double theophany? It's an appearance of the Lord.
Mm.
So she doesn't receive just an appearance of the Lord just once. She receives it twice.
Mm.
There's only one other woman in the Bible that receives that.
Right. Cherry Love says, "Men of God, you're not allowed to do this." No. Yes, Cherry, we know. No, we're not advocating for the concubine's gambit.
This is descriptive, not proscriptive.
Yeah. me and David are both very, happily married men who love the Lord. And I don't think our wives would even put up with that, even if we tried. Not that I even want to, but I just want to put it out there on record.
Won't happen. Nope.
No siree. But somebody asked,
trouble Abraham got in.
Yeah, exactly. Like a whole new empire was birthed because of his, indecision. But someone asked a question here. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, so you're making a lot of claims, about slavery in ancient Egypt, and someone here wants to talk about the glyphs. And I'm assuming then meaning, where are you gathering this information from when it comes to slavery in ancient Egypt?
Okay. Well, the fact is you find texts regarding slavery all over the place. The hem is a very, very common word for a servant or a slave. And you find that in lists of slaves like the Lahun Papyrus of Sobek Hotep. You find that in, say, the stela. There's a stela of Amenhotep II where he's bringing back lots of slaves from Canaan. There's just so many texts dealing with slaves, and as war booty, it's an uncontestable term.
Right.
It's uncontroversial. I mean, no one contests it.
Right. Okay.
Except apparently maybe in the conscious community.
I like that. Nice little shot there.
But it's not contested in Egyptology.
So I was going to ask something. What was I going to say? I just forgot my question.
And the glyph for him, by the way, is a club. It's actually a club.
Yes. So this is important for us to discuss, because a lot of times, we tend to romanticize Egypt, and not taking anything away from the greatness of Egypt, because it was an amazing empire, or empires, depending how.
Well, it wasn't an empire.
Well, I stand corrected.
It was a nation.
It was a nation. But they didn't aspire to be empire? Did they aspire to be?
Not really.
No. Okay.
We have to understand that Egyptians' concept of it was more of a stay-at-home empire. At its very height, it only expanded up to the Orontes in Syria. It never grew into anything more than that, and that's because they didn't put a lot of resources into to hold an empire. You have to put in resources.
Right.
You have to put in resources to hold an empire. And what the Egyptians did in, say, the New Kingdom was they would set up these little towns, these garrison towns. And these garrison towns were really small. They were only at most 1,000 people, and only half of those may be soldiers. That's not enough to hold a vast empire. That's only enough to keep little vassal city-states in check. Run a report if things go really south. There were more monitoring stations than really, the sword, as it were.
Okay.
Basically, what happened was Egypt tried to control lands that if they needed to run out and fix it fast, they could do it. So they weren't interested in land holdings that were far away. They weren't like Assyrians. They weren't like Babylonians. They weren't setting up governorships and reorganizing societies. They were basically putting these small outposts in the lands they conquered so they could collect tribute.
Right.
And as long as the tribute kept coming, they didn't care.
Wow. So that's really good. Because again, there is greatness, but there is a lot of stuff that believers, when we look at it, is just horrifying. You know, the fact
They're
that
a military dictatorship. They're a
right.
military dictatorship, and Pharaoh is the dictator.
So with that being said, is anyone really free in ancient Kemet? If that's the case?
No.
Wow.
No,
So,
not really.
So freedom was really more just
Freedom?
was
Ancient
talk.
Egypt?
Right.
Look, I mean, the class, the craftsman class, okay, which is the class, say, between your slave and your military.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is your middle class, your craftsman class. They were kept in sequestered villages under 24-hour guard.
The middle class.
The middle class.
Wow.
They couldn't leave those villages. They were stuck there. They couldn't leave. They weren't allowed to leave.
And we're talking about the middle class.
The middle class.
The pretty privileged people. They have some privilege.
Oh, yeah.
And they could not leave.
They could not leave.
Wow. Okay, did not know that. That's crazy.
The guys that built Deir el-Medina were under constant guard 24/7. And the reason why they were under constant guard was because they had in their possession tools that belonged to the king and materials that belonged to the king.
Wow.
So to prevent them from stealing and selling those tools, they were under guard.
So the real question I should ask isn't whether or not they were slavery. The better question is, was anybody even free in ancient Kemet? Right? That would be the better question.
The better question and the real answer is not really.
Wow.
Not really.
Wow.
There was very, very limited freedom in Egypt. Now, there were freedoms. People could do certain things on their own initiative.
Right.
You know, men and women could adopt whoever they wanted unless they were children of the king.
Right. But I mean, it's crazy because, like, let's say, you know, if you want to come and hang out in New York, you go get your passport, you go to the airport, you take a flight down, and that's it.
Yeah.
They couldn't do stuff like that.
Nope.
So they were actually prisoners.
Pretty much.
Wow.
If you were a scribe, you probably traveled a lot more, but that was a requirement of the job.
Right.
You know, the king might send you.
You go where you're sent. You can't just like.
You go where you're sent.
You can't go
where
to
you're
the
assigned.
Levant for the spring. You can't just be like, hey, I'm just going to hang out over here.
Nope. Now, you're probably, I mean, if you were a scribe and you were attached to a military unit, yeah, you did a lot of traveling.
But
it wasn't a lot. It wasn't for vacation.
It wasn't for recreational purposes.
Nope.
Right. Wow. That's, woo. You see, I don't know if people know that about ancient Kemet. Like, the middle class were basically under lock and key by the Nasut beating. Wow.
Everyone was.
Everyone. Woo. So that would make sense why
even the regional governors had to stay within their governorships.
So they couldn't leave either.
No.
Wow. Okay.
Some of the royal princes got to travel, but even they didn't have a lot of freedom.
Man, this is definitely mind blowing right here. So, because again, you know, we hear about how majestic and it's the enchanted land where everybody's just holding hands and doing amazing musical performances with Andrew Lloyd Webber, and it's one big Broadway play. You know? Huh?
Everyone's sitting in the temple singing Kumbaya.
Yeah, I mean, that's if you let certain people tell it. Yeah, that's exactly what they show you. You know, and man, Egypt doesn't sound like the place to be at all. I mean, that's whew. Wow. That's deep. And so and another part that's very sobering is the fact that these people, you know, and I understand they were, you know, a mixed multitude, but these people, you know, were not technically, they're not white, and they would go and grab Nubian people, these Africans, and they would slay Africans in their temple to their gods.
Yes. They would do that to Nubians. They would do that to Cushites. They would do that to Libyans. They would do that to Canaanites.
Now, did they keep records
not
of this?
do that to Magi.
They did not do that to Magi.
They did not do that to Magi.
And why not?
Magi were special. Magi were useful. When the Magi were sort of annexed by Egypt, the Magi had a very interesting strategy. What they did was they basically said, hey, we can help you out. We'll be trustworthy. We'll help you guard your fortresses. We will do anything you want. We'll be your mercenaries. And the Magi just said, hey, we'll be the best, most loyal servants of the king you've ever seen.
Now, these are archers, right? The Magi, were they archers?
The Magi were a tribe that was in the area of Cush. Okay. So they weren't Cushites. They weren't part of the Cushite kingdom. But they were sort of in that region between, say, Thebes and Cush. And they were sort of a nomadic tribe initially. But they were also, say, quickly annexed by the Egyptians in the Middle Kingdom.
Wow. Ooh, that's a lot, man. That's a whole lot. So
so the Magi had a special place in Egypt.
But they were smart enough they saw the writing on the wall.
They saw the writing on the wall. Well, I mean, there was this cycle that usually happened where Egypt would conquer a kingdom, have to put down the people, put down the revolts. They would rule over that kingdom, collect tribute. Then a new king in Egypt would rise to the throne, and then that kingdom would revolt.
Right.
And then the new king would have to send in troops to break skulls. They never had to do that with the Magi. The Magi were always cooperative. And that fact that this was really early on recognized. So the Magi, in many respects, had much more freedom than even, say, the native Egyptians.
Because, again, they were useful.
They were useful. Magi traders were allowed to go past the boundary stela that was set up for the Nubians. There's a boundary stela that prevents the Nubians from traveling north. And it says basically on the boundary stela that Nubians are not allowed past this point. That did not apply to Magi. Magi could come and go as they pleased.
Wow. Wow, that's pretty good. So how about we take a couple questions before we wrap this up about slavery in ancient Egypt. So if anybody has a question, now is your time. Actually, Cherry did ask, wow, no, that's not what I wanted. She asked, I thought the Magi were swordsmen, but they were also swordsmen, yes?
They were mercenaries.
Right.
Yeah. In fact, during the second intermediate period, they played this game where they actually were mercenaries for both sides.
Yeah.
They hired themselves out to the Thebans to protect the Theban southern border, and they hired themselves out to the Cushites to protect their northern border. And they played both sides against the middle and never got caught.
Wow.
Never got caught.
Wow. That's crazy. But
they were very clever. They're very clever.
What they said, something about brings new meaning to let my people go. So when Moses, knowing that everybody was under lock and key and everybody's basically in servitude of the Pharaoh, when Moses comes and says, let these guys go, wow. That must have been the most blasphemous thing Pharaoh has ever heard in his life.
It had a lot of moxie. Yeah. He's basically telling Pharaoh, release the people. And Pharaoh's going, well, why should I? I don't release anybody else. What makes me so special?
Right. especially people who are outside the social strata, which was the Israelites.
Yeah, they're outside the social strata. They have no standing.
Right. So if the middle class can't leave, how much more you guys? So
yeah, you're slaves. Why should I let you go?
Here's a question here. So the Magi were equivalent to the Praetorians?
Not quite. They weren't a royal guard. Okay, they were more of, as I say, they in the second intermediate period they were more mercenaries. In the New Kingdom, what they were is then sort of they filled in various positions across Egypt. They were distributed across Egypt, where they were guards, policemen, and community leaders. You do find them where they're also leaders of their respective communities.
Okay. You kind of answered this earlier, but if you don't mind answering again, it says so they used slave labor, but didn't make the trade of slaves.
Not in the respect that in Egypt there was a demand for slave labor. There was always a demand for slave labor, whether that was for upperclassmen wanting to have slaves in their household, to administer the house, to make provisions for the house, the so-called overseer of the house. There was always that demand for slaves in Egypt, whether it was on say a household level or say on a more institutional level by the king himself.
Right.
So there was always a trade of slaves, but when the king needed a lot of them, he went to war.
So Cherry says, wait. So Moses wasn't just talking about the Israelites when he said that? No, he was talking about Israel.
He's talking about Israel, but he's also there was included many other people too. The mixed multitude. Avaris was a very cosmopolitan city. It was very cosmopolitan. It had the sons of Jacob, which would later become Israelites, but also it had Magi, Libyans, Amorites, other Canaanites, Cushites, Nubians, Egyptians. It was a very cosmopolitan city. And this entire mixed multitude becomes grafted into the 12 tribes to become the Israelites after the Exodus.
Right. Absolutely. How does slavery in ancient Egypt affect their relations to Black Africans today?
Very little, I think. I think Black Africans today have, say, a different history. Now, if you talk about to Black Africans today, they have sort of a different perspective on slavery than, say, people in America. I had a conversation once with a Tanzanian, and the issue of slavery had come up, and his sort of view was, well, Americans were just buying a problem on our behalf. They were prisoners of war and they were selling them to the Dutch. Okay. For them, it was a logistical problem. Either they had to kill these prisoners of war or just sell them into slavery. And they chose that latter option.
Wow. So
the events in ancient Egypt are so far removed from the Black African experience of today. And we have to kind of remember that Egypt itself is sort of isolated from the rest of Africa. It's surrounded by desert. It's surrounded by cataracts. It's really difficult to move in and out of Egypt from Africa itself unless you take sort of a more Red Sea approach to access. So you didn't have a lot of interchange between, say, Africa and, say, Egypt and Ethiopia, which would be its sort of Sudan, Ethiopia being its closest neighbors.
Right. Okay. Cool. Teti wants to know, what's the sources for the freedom narrative? I'm assuming
the freedom narrative.
I'm assuming the paperwork that if a slave is adopted. I'm assuming, is that what you mean, Teddy?
Yeah.
Like where did he get that from?
Okay, we find that paperwork mentioned in the ostraca from Deir el-Medina.
Okay,
That's where we find that.
Cool. Ivan wants to know, how did a pharaoh surmise his strength if imperial conquest was not the natural objective of Egypt? On what basis did Pharaoh surmise his power? Good question.
Oh, that was the ability to protect Egypt from its enemies. What was traditionally called in Egypt the 9 bows. Now, the identity of the 9 bows changes over time, but these were the traditionally Egypt considered its enemies to come from 9 particular nations. And one of these nations is Kush, one of them is Libya, and so on. And as I said, these 9 bows change over time. But the ability to protect Egypt and its borders from incursions of the 9 bows was sort of the quality that Egyptian kings judged their strength.
Actually, Teddy clarifies. He says, no, the one that everybody was a slave. How do we know that people couldn't move on their own? The middle class were, sequestered.
Well,
how do we know?
We know the middle class couldn't move because we have, again, Deir el-Medina is our greatest source because we have thousands and thousands of ostraca from there. We've got papyri from there. We've got even a sample of a day roll. The strike papyri, the Turin strike papyri, is probably one of our greatest sources here, because the strike papyri tells us about how the Magi, the guards of, say, the temples and of the Deir el-Medina, restricted the freedom of the craftsmen when they went on strike.
Okay, cool. So before we wrap things up, Dr. Falk, what are some things that we could be expecting from you in the immediate future?
Wow. Well, always more YouTube videos. Good. There's always going to be more YouTube videos. Right now I'm working on some papers. I'm working on a little blog for Biblical Archaeology Review.
Oh, nice.
Discussing the content of my recent book. There's a lot in the works. So
now, is biblical archaeology, aren't they a little bit on the minimalist side of town? Do they? Well,
they publish my stuff.
That's what I'm asking. That's why I'm shocked. Like they're minimalists over there. So
some of them are so. Well, the Biblical Archaeology Review has a wide variety of writers. Okay, it's not just, say, biblical minimalists.
Okay.
They've published people like Alan Millard, Kenneth Kitchen. They've published myself. I mean, my article on the Israelites making of mud bricks. They published that.
Here's one more question. I'm sorry. Go ahead, David. Oh, okay. So, what are Dr. Falk's thoughts on the Shasu of Yahweh?
Okay, the Shasu.
Shasu. Sorry.
Shasu.
Shasu. Shasu.
You'll get it eventually. Yes. There's a few things that we have to consider here. It doesn't actually say Yahweh. It says Yahu. Now, we don't know if that's Yahweh or if that's a place name. That's the first issue here. The second thing is that the Shasu were a migratory tribe. They were nomads that went from Midian into Edom, into the Sinai. They were all over the place. And they go back at least as far as Tutmosis II. So they're well into the early New Kingdom. So the Shasu of Yahweh is a reference that we find at, say, the Temple of Soleb, dated to Amenhotep III. It's the only reference we have of it, and it's in a captive circle. So we are not exactly sure of, say, what it refers to. So there's a lot of guesswork here going on. Okay,
cool, good stuff. Where can people reach you via YouTube? What is your YouTube handle?
Ancient Egypt and the Bible. That's the name of the YouTube channel.
Cool. And you do have a book that is out.
Yes, I do.
Can you tell us a little bit about it?
It's the Ark of the Covenant in its Egyptian context, an illustrated journey, published by Hendrickson Publishers.
This is an interesting question, and this will be the last one for the night. And I think you've actually done a video on this. Are Hyksos Hebrews? The
answer is no. But also possibly a little yes. Now, here's what the Hyksos are. The Hyksos are the leaders of the city of Avaris. Hyksos literally means foreign ruler. So they're actually the rulers of the Amoritic Semitic population at Avaris. So they're not technically Hebrews. They're not technically Israelites or the sons of Jacob. What they are is the leaders of the city of Avaris. And they're thrown out of Avaris at the beginning of Dynasty 18 by King Ahmose I. And the Israelites continue to live in Avaris until the beginning to mid Dynasty 19.
So
now the Israelites and the people of Avaris are both Amorites. They're Amorites, Semitic Canaanites, as it were.
Right.
But the one is not technically the other.
But one could be.
One could be. The people of the Hyksos could have been part of the tribes that left with the Israelites.
So that kind of makes sense. That's why there would be some kind of confusion if there was some kind of admixture between the two.
Yeah.
Right. So
now some of the Hyksos rulers do flee Avaris and go to a city called Sherohen. 3 years later, they are completely defeated by the Egyptians, and that's the end of the Hyksos right there.
Okay. And what time period would that be?
Egyptians, that's around 1530, 1527.
Okay.
The Egyptians wipe out the leadership entirely.
Wow.
The Egyptians were very, very thorough about defeating the Hyksos leadership.
Cool. I know you're working on a blog and you're writing some papers. How about another book? Can we expect another book in the horizon?
I would love to do another book on the plagues of Egypt. I would love to do that book. The problem is funding. I need funding to do it. One of the problems with writing books is it requires a lot of time.
Right.
In order to write a book, you still need to put food on your table and pay the bills as you do it. So for somebody like me to make another book, I have to have the free time to do it. And that only comes with funding.
Well, hopefully.
But I would love to do one on the plagues of Egypt. It would be fascinating.
So you don't think it's just, natural phenomenon? You don't think a big gust of wind split the Red Sea? And
I don't know what split the Red Sea. I wasn't there.
Oh man!
But there is a lot of interesting stuff about the plagues. A lot of it is cultural back references into, say, Egyptian culture. Fascinating.
Right.
Fascinating and very much not discussed in, say, the literature.
But if you was there, you would get the punchlines.
Oh, if you were there, you got the punchlines. Because frankly, they got the punchlines.
Well, yeah.
One of the things we find in ancient Egypt is, we talk about, say, these prophecies of Nefertiti and Ipuwer and all that. And these are all Middle Kingdom texts. These aren't New Kingdom texts.
Right.
They're Middle Kingdom texts. But most of the copies of these texts that we find date to two periods of time. The beginning of Dynasty 18 and the beginning of Dynasty 19. And if we look at what's happening in both those time periods, it makes perfect sense. Beginning of Dynasty 18 is when Avaris is conquered by the Egyptians. King Ahmose I is seen as the new Amenemhat I, the guy bringing new order to Egypt, restoring Egypt's power and glory and its imperial hopes. And it's at that point that these are become very, very, these texts have a great, say, traction. The other, even larger cluster of these texts that we find is beginning to mid-Dynasty 19. Well, what's happening during that point is the Exodus, where we see all these plagues of Egypt.
Right.
And now people are going, all this garbage is going on. What's going on? So they're going back to these Middle Kingdom texts to try to find meaning of all these catastrophes in the texts.
So they're making copies of those older texts because they find a fresh connection between their current
There's
status.
a new framework.
There's a new framework, right?
Basically, what those texts were ex eventu prophecy. Prophecy written after the fact. They were prophecies predicting, quote, predicting the rise of the new king Amenemhat I that would restore order to Egypt after the chaos of the first intermediate period.
So that same literature that's supposed to showcase his kingdom
to legitimize the 12th dynasty.
So it gets subverted then.
It gets reinterpreted. It's long after that political drama is forgotten about in the 12th dynasty, the texts have survived.
Right.
And those texts are recontextualized for a new generation. It's recontextualized and people are reading it as new prophecy.
Right. So if you lived during that time and these events are occurring, you have a reference point.
You do.
Yeah, you gotta write this book, bro. We gotta figure it out. Man. We gotta figure it out. Here's a quick thing. I did say that was the last question, but this is more of a statement. I just want your thoughts on it. Zion Lex is preaching that Abraham came to Egypt around 2000 BC.
That's too early. Too early. He comes to Egypt around 300 years after that.
Okay.
He comes to Egypt around 1700, between 17 and 1800 BC.
Right. And you actually have a really good video about Abraham. A lot of people like to say that Abraham did not exist. And you have a video on your channel that you point out some things in the scriptures that really gives us a lot of great confidence in the actual reality of Abraham. So I definitely enjoy that. But yeah, bro, you gotta write this book, man. Because I didn't even think so they repurposed. That makes They recontextualized the texts without the original context of that text. They took that text and recontextualized it for their own context. Could that make sense?
We do this. People do this with the Bible too.
Yeah.
How many times have people taken the Book of Revelation and reinterpreted it for current events?
Right. So that's what they did.
Wow,
that's amazing. But listen, we're about to hit an hour. So before we go, is there any last things you would like to share with the people before we're out of here?
Well, I've really enjoyed being on here again. This is time number 5.
Yep, I think so. I think have you been here the most? Yeah, I think you are my most. What's the word? You haven't requested, but you probably appeared the most out of everyone so far. I think you're leading the way here. So this is good stuff. So all right.
Hey, I'm your Egyptologist, and you're not going to let me go.
No, I'm not. You have been sequestered. You have been sequestered on my channel, sir. So, with that being said,
I hear the Magi outside on the door.
there you go. You're not going nowhere, buddy. You're saying right there. Oh, man, that's hilarious. All right, so that's Dr. David A. Falk and BK Apologist signing off. Catch you later. Peace.